Syracuse University, New York, where he currently teaches in the Department of Philosophy. He is the author of numerous works in contemporary philosophy and critical theory, and the founder of the Society for the Study of Biopolitical Futures. He was recently invited to our department as a guest lecturer of a summer school on Foucault's dispositif. His talk tonight, Saving les Différends, or at least to preserve the honor of thinking, builds upon a notion coined by French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, with which our speaker studied in the 1990s at the University of California. Ladies and gentlemen, Gregg Lambert.
Well, Felicity suggested that I just continue to drink wine while I give my talk, but I'll spare you that and stay, because I also have jet lag, so I don't know what would happen if I did that. So in case people might not be familiar immediately with the quote that the title is taken from, it's taken from pretty much the beginning section of Le Différend in the section on the dossier, where this statement appears, and in translation, to find, if not to be able to legitimate judgment, which is what the talk is going to be about. And Lyotard defines as le bon enchaînement, the good enchainment or good chaining of phrases, at least how to save the honor of thinking. Much of Lyotard's effort in the last works is to create what he calls passages or crossings, Übergänge, between three senses of archipelago that are dispersed throughout Kant's late political writings. Whatever the cause of this dispersion is historically speaking a subject of intense speculation, and I'll return to speculate on this question myself in a moment, but may have even simply had been brought about, or the cause of the dispersion, is that Kant died before he was able to compose what he would call the metaphysical elements of politics in the French le politique, in the manner of the first three critiques. Still others have argued that such a metaphysics would never have been possible, or is possible today to begin with, and that Kant would have been quite mad to even conceive of its possibility. And in fact, there's a third possibility, that in fact Kant was quite mad at the end of his life, and he was senile, is going into senile, and even there have been claims that he was suffering schizophrenia. Regardless, whatever the cause, following Lyotard's major claim in his later works, particularly in Why He Returns to Kant with a Vengeance, one could say, is that the critique of political reason was never written. And yet, we can find the proper object of such a potential critique that can indeed be found dispersed in a number of discrete signs that appear like a chain of islands in an archipelago, and according to the three following senses. The first sense: the dispersion of Kant's late political writings on politics do not form a systematic critique of political reason, but nevertheless may constitute a preliminary map of the isolines of the future critique. And thus I emphasize it is a critique that remains today to be fashioned, and I would even describe Lyotard's attempt in Le Différend and other writings, Enthusiasm, for instance, that was a bit of a preliminary draft, as providing only what Lyotard himself calls a sketch, entref, a design, a preliminary draft of the critique of political reason. Therefore, it seems completely appropriate for me to enter into this draft to continue to revise or to refine it. So we must first of all also not treat Lyotard's late draft of this final work, or in short, to say that Lyotard has a completed political philosophy. Second sense: the dispersion of the faculties is exemplarily dramatized in Kant and the determination of the sublime presentation, the Darstellung, which can no longer be regulated or legislated by the understanding and the speculative interest of reason. In this example, the faculty of judgment if it is indeed a faculty at all, or is called, or we must return to call it simply a power of judging. And Lyotard will always underline this claim, whether judgment is a faculty, or is it, how do we conceive of it as a power? And where is that power located? What is its object? How is that power translated between different phrases, political, ethical, moral, aesthetic? And so in a certain way, this becomes, in a sense, the entire basis of Lyotard's translation of the Kantian sublime. Remember, is the different faculties are dispersed and enter into an unregulated or discordant accord. And Lyotard wants to, in a sense, dramatize that accord as in the form of archipelagos or archipelago islands between phrases. Lyotard only further dramatizes or exaggerates the situation of the heterogeneity of the original Kantian faculties by defining them as phrase families, following Wittgenstein's critical conception of judgment, which Lyotard claims quite, I haven't really confirmed or completely agreed with this, that Wittgenstein completely derives his understanding of judgment from Kant in order to define, for instance, in philosophical investigations, the faculty of judgment. Quote from Lyotard, in my narrative of the history of philosophy, he says, this is where Wittgenstein, the philosophical investigations, directly picks up the relay of the critique. That is why I use the expression phrase family rather than representation, unquote. Finally, the third sense of an image of archipelago is the dispersion of the idea of human community, the idea of world, into an archipelago of what I will call continental islands. As I have written elsewhere, it is this last dispersion that I will assign the question of Europe today. Europe is a continental island in an archipelago of other islands, such as the Americas, Asia, and Africa. This contemporary archipelago of political reason, which reveals gaps between different human communities and even between different histories that no longer belong to the same past and consequently may no longer share the same future. As a result, we are presented with the loss of an idea that represents, even in a regulative, purely virtual or schematic manner, the complete extension of a community of reasonable beings in the form of a world, which was formerly an object of philosophical representation, or what Lyotard calls a phrase regime. In part, I'm taking my definition of a continental island from Deleuze, who said that continental islands are born of disarticulation, erosion, fracture, and survive the absorption of what once contained them, unquote. However, this sense can also be found in Lyotard as well, who often describes the faculty of judgment, or the power of judgment, as an admiral who launches ships from one island to the next, back and forward, not just bringing back empirical data acquired through war, commerce, colonization, and capitalism, but also rules and formations of the connection, phrase families and genres of discourse. I realize concerning this last image of an archipelago composed of continental islands that I'm not employing the geological term precisely, but trying to dramatize the dispersion of territories and continents into distinctive formations brought about by the failure of the powers of imagination, reason, and understanding, what Kant constituted as faculties, to conceive of the cosmopolitical constitution of the community of intelligent beings. I could also demonstrate this by tearing up, go to the next one, by tearing up a map of the world and strewing the torn pieces across the floor of this auditorium, except in order to be accurate, I would also have to tear up the continuum of space and time that are assumed to be a priori to the condition of unity, expressed in geometrical or mathematical form as the basis of any map. There is, and of course I can't do that. Okay, so there's a narrative, but there is also a narrative form of temporal presentation of the idea of community that I will address in the conclusion, since this will play an important role in Kant's latest or last writings on human history, As I already observed, Europe would only be one continental island among others, or a human community among others, according to one cultural Bildungsroman traditionally associated with the Enlightenment, in which the European community has formally enjoyed the role of a protagonist in the philosophical novel. Although a question that will occur to us naturally is whether Europe still plays that role today, which is far from certain, even by the fact that one cannot say that Europe is one community, even in a practical or regulative idea of the European unions of nations. And I would say more and more, the very idea of this community is placed in question in light of events that have occurred recently and exposed by some, by its antagonists, as a fiction along purely political and ideological and economic lines. However, I won't enter into a question of who might emerge on the global stage today to assume the formal role of the protagonist of universal history. Although Lyotard will announce the failure of a certain Bildungsroman of reason in his earlier and more formative definition of the postmodern condition, the decline of the grand narrative of progress in human history, one could argue that Kant had already foreseen the failure in his later political writings, especially in the writings around the principles of politics and towards perpetual peace, when he argued that a complete metaphysical system of justice, that is, a practical system of reason, the elements of which he laid out in the Reitlehre, could not even be attempted until a list of preliminary conditions have been met that would establish the basis, or the Grund, the Satz, or even the very legal basis for the critical tribunal of reason to practically enter into any discussion of a cosmopolitical constitution of the human community, and of a final end of the political question. Kant said, as long as even a portion of humanity is under the threat of war, he declares an important passage, there cannot be any justice, any possible justice for the whole species. At the same time, Kant also outlined many arguments against the success of his own sketch of human history, which I'll point out below. He must resort to a pure fabulistic or natural and divine fable of providence. Particularly the consolidation of the nation states in the 18th century, premised on the right of war, the continued involvement and expansion of Europe into the colonial project, he declares in a very critical prophecy that mankind will become so disposed against one another that the idea of perpetual peace will become a wide open grave piled with corpses, unquote. That's from Perpetual Peace. Of course, the reality of this wide open grave was bored into the European continent less than 2 centuries later and was named Auschwitz. And this is not by accident that it appears as the first case concerning the cause of the dispersion of universal political reason, as well as the beginning, episodically, in the European Bildungsroman, of the moment of downgoing, Untergang, of the European protagonists in the cultural Bildungsroman of history of reason, which is to say, the novel we have basically been reading and rewriting in several different versions for the last century after that. I won't go further into this part of the European novel, except to observe that it is offered again as the first explanation of the dispersion of political reason, is the first case in the Différend. Moreover, in keeping with Kant's earlier premonitions, as I've recounted only a few of them above, the failure and dispersion of the critique of political reason, at very least its state of incompletion, existing only as a sketch, and as I said earlier, only as notes or experimental Passagenwerk in Lyotard's late philosophy, that he also makes an argument against the entire tradition of neo-Kantian scholarship, that what has been called the doctrine of right, the Reitlehre, or the second critique, quote, is not a pertinent text for studying the political in Kant, unquote. Nor perhaps, as the French would say, la politique, to be political in a Kantian sense. Unquote. So let's turn to the situation of the Différend, and I'll put my archipelagos back up here. As I have just described, if the field of the critique of political reason is summarily dispersed throughout a number of heterogeneous phrase families whose arrangement can best be represented by an archipelago of continental islands, then the object of critique is, according to Lyotard, the differend and not the phrase, but rather the feeling that rises from an unstable and instant of language when something calls to be put into phrases and yet cannot, unquote. Let us recall that the Différend begins with three cases as if presented before the critical tribunal. The first of which is most commonly associated with the argument, of course, is the testimony of the Holocaust victim concerning the reality of the gas chambers as evidence of the final solution, which the opposing party denies for lack of actual eyewitnesses. The Différend appears when the absolute verification is demanded, which would be immune to the failure of language to establish a rule of judgment between the opposing parties. The second case, then of course this is a failure, because in a sense, the very question of evidence, of evidentiary presentation, of representation can always be denied or refuted. And so Lyotard said, the Différend then appears by the existence of a crime that cannot be fundamentally verified in a common phrase regime. The second case that appears is the judgment, and this is an interesting one, of an anonymous masterpiece that was never published, and thus is known only to the author. This is the second case of judgment, basically, and it is the speculative genre of philosophy and its myth of natural genius, or what Deleuze refers to as the Greek myth of the celestial stranger, but which pathetically depends on historical and disciplinary protocols of legitimation that are never immune to error, but has even been exposed to, that the completely redacted text of reason has been exposed to various catastrophes, historically speaking. And of course, we bear the seed of this delirium or error. Every philosopher believes that they're writing the great masterpiece of philosophy, and nobody recognized the truth. And so, in some ways, this is, in a sense, Lyotard is playing a bit with the very genre of philosophy and the Différend that appears at the basis of philosophical representation of an idea. How many great works of philosophy have gone completely unrecognized, as if the universe of phrases was engulfed in the grand conspiracy against the truth? Quote, "Can you give me," says the editor, defending his or her profession, "the title of a work of major importance which would have been rejected by every editor and would therefore remain unknown," unquote. No, there is only silence or multiple silences that exist in the void opened at the base of the ground of the history of philosophy, whose heads are downturned like the damned in Virgil. In this case, Lyotard shows the argument takes the same form as the previous case that establishes the problem of the reality of the Différend. Quote, "Reality is not given to this or that subject, but rather the state of the referent that results from the effectuation of establishment protocols. Accordingly, the publishing industry would be one protocol in the second example, while historical inquiry would govern the first," and that's a quote from Lyotard. However, it is the third case offered by Lyotard, the one that most readers have skipped over or simply stopped reading altogether, since they were satisfied that this work was ultimately about the status of the testimony of Holocaust victims, where we might find some implicit commentary on the establishment protocols of a certain modern historical critical tribunal of political reason, and particularly the critical tribunal that operates today in North American universities and in the cultural politics of identity politics. I'll make some reference to that. It is drawn from the satirical Russian novel The Yawning Heights by Alexander Zinoviev, and is formulated in the following paraphrase, quote, "Either Ibanskian is not a communist, or he is. If he is, he has no need to testify. since he admits that the communist authorities are the only ones competent to effectuate the establishment procedures for the reality of the communist character of that society. If he ceases to give his agreement to these authorities, there is in this case no more credit to be accorded to his testimony than that of a human being who says that he's communicated with aliens, unquote. In either case, the object of judgment in question is an idea of historical political reason, the communist character of identity or any social identity as such, which is not an object of cognition, and since there exists no protocol in general and universally for establishing the reality of subjectivity or subjective identity, unless one defers to a certain tribunal of reason in order to decide the case, then all claims or judgments are based on different. Implicitly drawing upon the Kantian critique of transcendental illusion, Lyotard claims that a differend occurs anytime the reality of political reason is established by means of a protocol employed for an object of cognition. And this is an important, in other words, that the idea of there's something about political phrases, political judgments that are treated as cognitive judgments, and this creates the problem of injustice, I mean, basically, the problem of the differend. That's why I quote Lyotard, it's important to distinguish between phrase regimens, and it comes down to limiting the competence of a given tribunal to a given kind of phrase. In all three cases, Lyotard concludes, to the privation constituted by damage, there is added the impossibility of bringing the case to the knowledge of others, and in particular to the knowledge of a given or certain historical tribunal. That is what a wrong would be, and he uses the term tort. A damage, dommage, accompanied by the loss of means to prove the damage. In response to this situation, Lyotard invokes a common law protocol as the basis for determining his concept of the differend. That is to say, an area of tort law that exists outside or before the codex of criminal legal codes, in which the determination of a wrong is based on positive laws, already given judgments. In common law jurisprudence, on the other hand, if a similar dispute has been resolved in the past, the court is usually bound to follow the reasoning used by the prior decision, known as stare decisis. Therefore, it is only the preceding phrase that is linked to the current one, and thereby converting the damage into a wrong. If, however, the court finds the current dispute is fundamentally distinct from all previous cases, the legislative statutes of law are either silent or ambiguous on the subject, and we could think of many differends that have emerged in contemporary societies around sexuality, around identity, where this is the case. Then the judges have, in this case, and in this case only, the authority to resolve the issue, since the axiom is that one party must always win the suit, and make a decision in the form of a judgment called a matter of first impression. Here we find the principle, if not the temporality, of the specific type of judgment that Lyotard has in mind, that he employs as a concept or situation of the differend, which can be distinguished from the Kantian concept of right, or le droit, or ius. And I will say more about this in a moment. Consequently, the objective of Lyotard's reflection on the situation of the differend is precisely to discover those damages that, as of yet, have not been able to be phrased according to the precedent of a prior judgment, that is to say, those differend that exist without phrases, and thus cannot establish the reality of their damage. As Lyotard writes, it's the nature of the victim not to be able to prove that one has been done a wrong. A plaintiff is somebody who has incurred damages and who's disposed of a means to prove it. One becomes a victim only if one loses these means, unquote. Let us now invoke the situation of a subjective feeling that arises from an unstable state or instant of language wherein something calls to be put into phrases and yet cannot. One can say, for example, I have suffered an injustice. And this is certainly a phrase, but the phrase would fall upon deaf ears unless it was accorded a protocol for establishing the reality of a wrong. Thus, it would amount to no more than saying, I have communicated with aliens, or I have an unconscious toothache, and would be dismissed often as a form of nonsense. As is often the case, lacking any protocol, the phrase would be seen or suspected as tantamount to lying, as an accusation in its most extreme sense of madness, as when you say, you're just imagining things. You could be quite insane. You, in a sense, are falling ill. If the plaintiff persists in invoking the reality of a wrong that does not exist, lacking any legitimation protocols, then he or she would really be mad, and so the plaintiff usually chooses instead to fall silent rather than pursue the claim any further and risks something much worse than silence. You see, what I'm getting at here is a certain madness that lies at the basis of the universe of phrases defined by the silence or the multiple silence of the differend, lacking any means of establishing the reality. The victims, for instance, of the extermination are all dead. You cannot tell me the title of an unpublished manuscript or masterpiece, and either Ebaskian is not a communist or he is. On the basis of the above description, we must hypothesize that the silence of the universe of damages is infinitely larger, quantitatively speaking, than the finite number of phrases that express the reality of wrongs. Remember, silence is a phrase or a multiplicity of phrases that may secretly conceal a damage or multiple damages. The differend is an unstable state of language, either covered over by silence, as when someone cannot speak or cannot find a phrase, accompanied by a feeling of pain or privation and pleasure when an idiom is found. At what point can we inquire, does a damage rise to the level of being recognized as a wrong? And how would this whole discussion in Lyotard's last work have something to do with what traditionally is called political philosophy? In the above discussion, I've defined the role of critical philosophy according to both the Kantian and Lyotardian description. One, the role, if not the duty, of the philosopher is to examine a given case, and where there is a phrase, an addresser, an addressee, an object, or referent, to discriminate or to make judgments by assigning phrases to their proper phrase families, and where there is no precedent, to invent new phrases. For example, to form linkage between silence, which is also a phrase, to a new phrase that will include addresser, addressee, and referent. And yet, in distinction from the Kantian definition of the philosopher in the role of the judge or legislator, Lyotard's particular situation only addresses those situations where the rules of precedent are completely lacking. And since we recall from the above, the differend appears when there is no rule, no precedent, and the nature of judgment itself exists only when there is no first phrase, a matter of first impression. This accounts for the phrase, in this case, which is in Lyotard constantly repeated throughout. In this case. In this case that constantly appears throughout the differend to determine the finite temporality of the phrase, the nature of the silence of the legislation and of the ambiguity or the silence of objective law on the question, and the privation or pain experienced by the victim in this case. I'm referring to the victim, to all those contemporaneous victims in all those unheard of and unknown cases where the legislative and executive tribunals are either silent or ambiguous concerning the existence of differend, real differend. Accordingly, for Lyotard, the philosopher's new role is to invent new phrases, given that, quote, what is at stake is to bear witness to a differend by finding new phrases for them, and not simply to augment for one's own benefit, scientific, economic, artistic, political, professional, the quantity of information communicable through existing phrases, but to recognize that which remains to be phrased exceeds what can presently be phrased. And although this problem of judgment is described as appearing in Lyotard and in Kant, who picks up the Kantian discourse here, in relation to a certain legal or critical tribunal, there is an analogous situation of the differend that can be found in the questions of judgment that are aesthetic, moral, political as well. This is why Lyotard questions the term faculty and instead begins to describe it more and more as a power that does not have one object, but object that is fractured, or multiple objects that are shared between same phrases. How do we judge? How do we know? I mean, all of these questions become very, very critical. I mean, this is Lyotard's discovery. What is critical? Okay? Now, granted, I admit that this seems like a pretty tepid definition of critical philosophy and threatens to reduce the tribunal of critical reason to being merely a language game a la Wittgenstein, which is a dominant interpretation of all of Lyotard's last works and of his own role of the philosopher. Some philosophers might object, and certainly Hegel did in his reading of Kant, that this is too reductive a description of the philosopher's positive discourse and role. It reduces philosophy itself to a kind of quasi-juridical form of judgment, but what's worse, a judgment that is completely powerless to effectuate a rule, since it lacks, in Hegel's terminology, any real effective negativity, in what Kant would call any executive authority or sovereignty, and what Lyotard calls real performativity. In fact, as a protocol of common law, the matter of first impression must always await the consensual instance of a subsequent phrase, but even then, the phrase that links to it does not transform it into law. There can only be a gradual accretion of judgments that then form the basis of a sensus communis. Nevertheless, this is what Lyotard might call an ideal chaining of phrases. In the finite situation of the differend, the philosopher judges only as if judging, and which either condemns the philosopher to play in a very speculative role in the name of the a priori idea of reason, or as in the case of the Kantian philosopher, who we remember is often accused of being merely academic or a theoretical philosopher and not a practical philosopher. Okay? Or it threatens the entire scene of judgment to becoming something grotesque and even morbid or comic, as in a situation or a common, basically as a scene from Kafka. For example, let's imagine the following scenario. The condemned man, upon hearing the verdict, felt the shackles immediately drop from his body and, filled with an incredible exuberance, leapt from his box like a gymnast and scurried out of the courtroom on all fours, head over heels, in leaps and bounds, like a dog chasing a butterfly in the garden. Forgive me for being carried away a bit with my own rhetoric, but how does this comic presentation really deal with the situation of what I'm calling the honor of thinking? And I'm going to kind of move towards the conclusion here. At this point, let's call before the current tribunal of political reason the differend between philosophy and what Lyotard identifies as the two principal adversaries that define what is at stake, the adversaries against what Lyotard defines as philosophy. On outside, the genre of economic discourse, exchange, capital, and on the inside, interestingly enough, the genre of academic discourse, as Lyotard defines the genre of mastery. Lyotard's overall argument is to engage a struggle or a battle with these two adversaries in order to save the honor of thinking, especially concerning the possibility of making good linkages between phrases of philosophy or phrases of aesthetic and phrases of politics. For example, by linking a certain feeling of the differend to, quote, vigorous signs of history that still express, and this might pick up Rudolph's talk, still express an enthusiasm for an idea of progress, the possibility of progress. And that, in a sense, an idea of progress, and despite the fact that today we are often more depressed by the apparent abyss that separates our relation to this idea than enthusiastic about the prospect that we are progressing towards any better state, as in, for instance, the state of Europe, the United States, which just had its midterm election earlier this week. The problem with the external adversary of the economic genre is that it dismisses the occurrence, the event, the marvel, the anticipation of a community of feelings out of hand. It's like talking with aliens, okay? So in other words, there's no, in a sense, it dismisses the idea of finality because it's interested, in a sense, linking from one instance to the next instance in order to, what Lyotard calls gagner, win or gain time. It is for this reason, Lyotard includes, that capitalism has never itself constituted a universal history. In fact, it was only Marxism that provided this narrative in order precisely to be capable of speaking about its end. But capitalism only produces a universal market, which it also continuously defers in order to produce the gaps it needs in the infinite expansion of a global economy, which is no longer based upon an idea of historical teleology. Lyotard criticizes the first adversary under the name of liberalism by saying that it accepts the stakes of the economic genre while priding itself on redistributive justice, mistaking economic exchange as the basis for the concept of political equality, and concludes that, quote, in principle, reformism will never make anybody happy, unquote. I think referring to a notion of happiness that can only be determined rigorously as a political notion in terms of its fulfillment, or in terms of its relation, not as an economic notion. But what about the second adversary? And this is the more critical one, I think, for us, for this audience. The one who hails from the inside of philosophy itself, the internal enemy. As an example, Lyotard speaks of, quote, the resistance of communities banded around their names and identities and narratives of culture and information as counting on to stand in the way of capital's hegemony. This is a mistake, Lyotard says. Why a mistake? First of all, because this resistance often fosters hegemony as much as it counters it. The hegemony of capitalism, or today, the hegemony of neoliberalism. And I don't think that the continued investment in a universal narrative of capitalism has been successful in countering its hold on human history, but has strangely consolidated its grip on the future, since it seems we can't imagine, or we're not imagining other alternatives except a post-apocalyptic future where zombies hunt down the last remaining human beings in order to eat their brains. Second, the second reason why it's a mistake is because resistance in the name of identity, culture, or community also, and this is the most interesting critique, postpones the idea of cosmopolitan history and falls back often on a fear of the return of legitimation through the tradition or myth of fascism, racism, or other forms of integrism and essentialism. In other words, and for lack of time, and I'm going to then conclude, what Lyotard identifies as a common trait in both adversaries is precisely the suspension of the idea of human history as having a final end, the idea of progress or continual improvement of practical political reason, which is indefinitely deferred by economic thinking and infinitely or indefinitely summarily postponed by the internal thinking that takes place within the genre of philosophy itself. In either case, there is always the temptation, then, for the critical tribunal of political reason to simply accept the current state of affairs in place of an idea of an end, and to begin functioning exactly like the tribunal in the farce by Zinioff, to actually begin to believe that its judgment has real effective, objective, cognitive power over subjects. In concluding my brief reflections on the archipelago of political reason today, I would remind you once again that the cause of the Différend is named a feeling of pain or privation. In this case, the privation felt by the imagination first for the idea of progress toward a better state of political reason, leading either capitulation or to a certain kind of pathological feeling of disillusionment, or even worse, to a spirit of revenge against time and it was, to quote Nietzsche. Concerning the idea of the end of human history, Lyotard concludes the 1981 lecture on the Kantian critique of history by invoking the Kantian definition of culture as an aptitude to propose for oneself ends in general. This aptitude, capacity, or power is not simply aesthetic in a narrow understanding of culture, but the cultivation of a susceptibility to ideas and the formal sensibility of taste that has an analogy in the realm of art, but also can function as the susceptibility of certain ideas that can, in a sense, enthuse, inspire, and impassion our relation to action within the moral and the political field as well. Thus, the concept of culture must include, quote, a trace of freedom in reality, which serves to edify and to cultivate the individual and the collective will. That is, the trace of what Kant called a supersensible idea that cannot be found in nature, which is the idea of a perfectibility of taste, knowledge, judgment, and virtue. In Kant's late writings especially, Lyotard observes the manner in which this trace of idea expressed is a Bildungsroman in the critical sense of the cultivation of the will in the above senses, aesthetic, ethical, moral, and practical or political. Now I'm going to conclude. However, as Kant says elsewhere in the Principle of Politics, it is because human nature is made up of such bent material. It is first in the realm of culture that certain final ends are attained, even while moral culture always lacks miserably behind it. What can be made straight in the area of culture can only provide tools for disciplining the moral and practical will, twisted by self-interest, power, oppression, pain, sadness, and disillusionment. At the same time, as in the case of the beautiful, it can only offer a consolation, and a pretty tepid one at that. And this is why, for Lyotard as well, the importance of the sublime, because even at the price of pain inflicted on the imagination and the understanding, there is the basis of a modification of a subjective disposition of self-affection that, in a sense, can either be a source of vitality or basically a cause of, in a sense, of what Lyotard calls weariness, lassitude, and exhaustion. In the Conjectures, Kant explicitly warned against, and I'm going to skip down here and just go to the conclusion here. What is remarkable about both the observations that Kant is making concerning his own philosophical culture, perhaps he was reading Rousseau after the Lisbon earthquake, where he catalogs the fact that the philosophers of his time, in a sense, had become far too pessimistic and were threatening to develop in a certain kind of pathological sensibility that would threaten the idea, that would, in a sense, threaten philosophy itself. And Lyotard invokes this as, in a sense, what are the signs of history today that, in a sense, inspire or create the possibility of enthusiasm for us within the field of action, within the field of practical action. Perhaps it is, what occurred to me at that moment is that we're still reading the same novels or Bildungsroman as Kant did 200 years ago, or at least some version of them concerning the same signs of history. For example, the novels of Agamben today, or the pulp fiction of Zizek concerning the end of all things. And if the novel is a form that is particularly human cultures, so as to impose on our experience a sensuous structure or schematism to the very conditions that organize the experience in terms of the a priori forms of space and time, then our capacity or incapacity to imagine a better state of things is dependent upon this primitive technological tool that was first employed by religions, later by philosophy, beginning with Hegel, and today by critical theory and other narratives. And so it recently occurred to me, only recently, or after I read this, or I had this epiphany, as Lyotard announced earlier, that we need a new competence or prudence in order to bear witness to the Différend, but we also, I believe, need an entirely new Bildungsroman as well. Upon realizing this, I have decided that I will immediately go about the business of writing the first draft, or sketch, and I hope that it will be finished sometime before I shuffle off these mortal coils, or that I succumb to a madness that is similar to Kant's narrative of providence. Although in saying this, you may already think that I've been talking with aliens. Although not as hopeful, the feeling or existential mood, to recall the effective tument of Heidegger, that predominates throughout Lyotard's late political writings could be called a kind of vigorous melancholy. And in the closing of the Différend, which lapses into silence, I remind you, and never actually concludes, he asks, quote, would a vigorously melancholic humanity be sufficient to be able to supply the proof that is progressing towards the better today, unquote. And what is the existential mood, therefore, of our new Bildungsroman that expresses this idea of feeling today? Would it be the calculated optimism of Kant, which is accused of being too Christian, or the vigorous melancholy of Lyotard, which is accused of being too pagan or Stoic, or maybe a different feeling that tempers the extremes of both Christian enthusiasm and Stoic melancholy with a materialist and Epicurean sense of humor? Maybe my own feeling, perhaps, although I have often been accused of being tragic. No matter, one does not choose one's particular existential mood. Rather, it chooses you. And it is a condition of feeling and impersonality. After all, no one has a feeling that belongs only to themselves. And this is why the feeling of the Différend is at the same time the condition of its communicability and the basis of a new sensus communis. Thank you.